Okay, is everybody ready? Good. Uh, Welcome to session number 6 of the our Justice University class. Today we're covering the principles of uh, sorry, we're doing a brief history of the Economic Democracy Act. And as Don said, you may want to take some notes on this, but there's a couple of slides. I wouldn't recommend that you try to write down. You can get the slides later. Uh, Now, the whole philosophy, I guess you could call it, of expanded ownership goes back to the dawn of time. Private property is a natural right, and that means every single human being has the right to be an owner by nature. It's part of what you are as a human being. And we see this in religious sources, such as the Bible, that speaks of the vine and fig tree, everyone sitting under his own vine and fig tree, which seems like a rather limited diet. But the idea is that you have a productive asset that provides you with what you need. The vine was something to drink and the fig tree was something to eat, I suppose. And Aristotle, who began the philosophy that we use in this course, Aristotelian Thomism, in his theory, his political theory, he did not consider you a full citizen unless you owned something. He considered, nominally free people who owned nothing in the way of a productive asset masterless slaves, because they were at someone else's beck and call. If they wanted to earn a living, they had to work for somebody else, not themselves. Now, fast forwarding to, the beginning of the United States, we had George Mason, who put into the Virginia Declaration of Rights of June 1776, which preceded the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson plagiarized from George Mason, although I can't prove it. George Mason included that one of the natural rights with which every human being is endowed, when people like George Mason used this as all men, they meant every human being. Don't try to finesse that. Just accept it that it meant every human being, even though the laws at the time did not allow every single human being to participate in these things. One of the natural rights that he included was the enjoyment of life and liberty, together with the means of acquiring and possessing private property. Thomas Jefferson left it out of the Declaration of Independence for various reasons we don't need to go into. It's called slavery. But not by coincidence, fast forwarding again, another, what was it, 87 years, 7 years? Okay, yeah. In 1862, actually 6 years, Abraham Lincoln, passed through the Homestead Act. And this opened up what they called the Great American Desert to settlement by offering usually 160 acres of land to anyone who was over the age of 21 and who was a U.S. citizen or had the stated intention of becoming one. And there were various ways of getting around this, and people abused it. But by and large, the Homestead Act is considered one of the greatest economic initiatives in history. There were earlier or similar efforts, but including the offer of 40 acres and a mule. That was a program run by one of the Union generals that, for political reasons, had to be terminated. We won't get into that today. But by and large, as I said, the Homestead Acts were extremely successful within certain limits. And it's the only country in the world that this has been carried out so successfully. A number of other countries did have Homestead Acts, but they seem to be either failures or were taken advantage of only by the wealthy. There were 250 million acres were transferred to private ownership, of which they estimated that half of them, they had an estimated 4 million claims, of which 2 million proved out. That's pretty good, considering that a lot of people were out there without adequate financing, which we'll mention in a minute, and were completely isolated. And there were so many problems with it that a lot of people are surprised that any part of it worked. The last claim was made in 1988 in Alaska. I understand that Alaska still has a state program of homesteading, as may other places, which if you want to freeze your behind off, you can probably still get it. But we don't need to get into that. Now, I did mention that there were some problems. Native American claims were generally ignored. There was no financing available except past savings, and that was at a time when past savings were being heavily depleted, both to pay off debts incurred during the Civil War and also because the government was deliberately attempting to restore parity of the paper currency, the national banknotes and the United States notes, with gold. At the end of the Civil War, a dollar in paper, a dollar in gold was worth $2.64 in paper officially, but you could probably sometimes with a dollar in gold buy up to $5 or $10 worth of something priced in paper dollars. This is how bad the inflation was. In the North, in the South, it was something like 12,000%. And of course, at the end of the war, you couldn't buy anything with Confederate money. Now, the financing problem was made even worse, considering that although the national bank system was made up of commercial banks, ordinary people didn't have access to that. Only the big ranchers, the railroads, and the large farmers and industries had access to the national bank system as commercial banks. Everyone else had to use them as banks of deposit, which meant that they had to rely on the pool of past savings, which was rapidly shrinking. And the last problem, of course, is land by its very nature is finite. In general, you can't make more of it. Now, we're going to fast forward again to the 1940s, and you see Eleanor Roosevelt's picture there. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations said that everyone has the right to be an owner and that no one can be arbitrarily deprived of his property. You have to go through due process before you can take anything, even by eminent domain. In a sense, eminent domain by the state, where the state comes in and says, we're condemning your property because we need it for public purposes. They can't do that without going through due process, and they have to pay for it. It's in a sense, depriving someone of his property, even through due process and paying a fair price for it, is a form of taxation. So it has to be done legally. You can't just come marching in and take it. Now, fast forwarding again, in the 50s and 60s, Lewis Kelso said, what we need is something that will do for, commercial and industrial assets what Lincoln's Homestead Act did for agricultural assets. And so in the 1967 book, in an appendix to two-factor theory, that's that down on the right-hand side there, he proposed a full production act. And this is based on principles explained in the Capitalist Manifesto from 1958 and the New Capitalists in 1961. And of course, the key thing that we look at it was mentioned in the Capitalist Manifesto, but it was expanded on in the New Capitalists. That is the monetary system. A sound monetary system to which every single person has access for financially feasible projects is absolutely essential to what we're talking about here. I mean, you kind of got away from that at the Homestead Act, even though the lack of financing probably caused most of those claims that were not proved to fail. And also, when you got to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, the lack of adequate financing meant that a lot of those farms were foreclosed on. Now, again, leaping forward again, in the mid 1960s, Kelso was proposing what did I call it? Or what did he call it? The Full Production Act. In 1974, Governor Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, in a speech to the Young Americans for Freedom said, we need an industrial Homestead Act. Well, when he came to be president, we did have the Presidential Task Force on Project Economic Justice. And there was some good noise about it, but it didn't go anywhere, even though it was probably a very good bipartisan effort, but we didn't get the momentum that we needed. And but in 1973, we did get the ESOP, which is part of Kelso's vision. And it had a champion, Russell Long, and it got, as far as it went, it was good, but it needed to go further. The first ESOP was, of course, set up in 1956, and then we had the ESOP enacted into law in 1973, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. Then you had 20 or more laws. You had state laws encouraging ESOPs. You had other countries doing it. You had the Presidential Task Force, which I already mentioned. And then you had USAID, and the World Bank did promote, Kelso's vision in a limited way for a short time. And then we also had the first ESOP law in the Middle East and Egypt. This was the Alexandria Tire Company. More about that later, perhaps, or you can look it up on the website. Then we also had the CLDC law in the Illinois House. We had a meeting yesterday. Was it only yesterday? With Senator Carla May, who helped get that through. And we also had the first state resolution through Carla May calling for the Economic Democracy Act. Okay, now the Economic Democracy Act itself, we started calling it the Industrial Homestead Act. Then we called it the Capital Homestead Act. And we think that we may now have settled on what we want to call it, the Economic Democracy Act. But it's not important what you call it. What's important is what it is, which is national legislation to promote universal citizen ownership. Actually, we could probably kick out the citizen part, because what we're looking for is every single person on earth becoming a capital owner. And maybe you aren't a citizen of something, but in which case it's even more important that you get ownership, because you need something to secure yourself as a member of society. Now, what the Economic Democracy Act does is it fills in the gaps, that should say of the 1862 Act, sorry. The one correction I should have made, I didn't make. In the 1862 Act, and extends the concept to all forms of productive wealth, whether you're talking commercial or industrial. And if you notice that in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the preface that you never see anymore says that one of the main reasons for having the act in the first place, for having a central bank, was to supply adequate accommodation for qualified industrial, commercial, and agricultural projects. I mean, the Homestead Act kind of came to semi-grief because of lack of financing. And one of the biggest problems with trying to get in, acquire commercial and industrial assets, capital assets, is the financing. Now, the great advantage to adding industrial and commercial capital to agricultural capital is that there is no effective limit to the capital frontier when you include the other 2/3 of it. And what Kelso added even to that was future savings financing. We addressed that in an earlier class, but basically what shackled the original Homestead Act was it relied, as I said, completely on past savings for most people. Only the big boys could get the future savings financing. Everybody else was stuck with past savings. And of course, commercial and central banking were invented to take advantage of future savings financing. Now, it also, the Economic Democracy Act also covers every single child, woman, and man throughout their lifetime, not just people who know how to farm or who are age 21 or who are citizens or have the intention of becoming one. Although initially, of course, it can only apply to citizens because that's the only way you can administer a thing at a national level. And you don't need any special skills or knowledge to be a shareholder. You do need one heck of a skill package to be a farmer or a rancher. You better know what you're doing out there, or you're going to die. especially in the 1860s and 70s. Now, the key reforms are, as I mentioned, monetary reforms, money, credit, and central banking. The original Homestead Act relied on past savings. The Economic Democracy Act relies on past savings, future savings, and commercial credit and central banking reforms that would reform the reserve currency to make it asset-backed instead of government debt-backed, and to provide as much as was needed by the economy instead of having some economic experts or politicians try to decide, well, how much money do we need? Well, money is not a commodity. Money is a tool by means of which we carry out economic activity. It's a means of measuring value. It is not itself a commodity, although that's the way it's treated and can sometimes be one, but we won't get into that. We don't need to. As much money as is needed is the commercial and central banking were invented to provide an economy with exactly as much money as it needs, no more and no less, without trying to second guess the economy. Now, tax reforms. There are certain tax reforms that will be needed. The main one is make dividends tax deductible at the corporate level. This encourages corporations to pay out dividends without forcing them by law to do it. Of course, you make it extremely advantageous for them to do it by making dividends tax deductible at the corporate level and raising the corporate tax rate, and then treating all dividends received by shareholders as ordinary income, except when they are used to acquire new capital shares under the Economic Democracy Act, in which case they're treated as a deferred tax, not tax exempt, they're tax deferred. Now, inheritance reforms will, instead of taxing the estate, tax the recipient. This encourages the breakup of estates rather than the conglomeration of them. Now, and I think I just anticipated myself by giving the entire talk on the summary page. The EDA monetary reforms for building the future economy is shift from government debt backing to private sector asset backing of the reserve currency. I mean, private sector money that is created in the private sector is automatically asset backed, or you go to jail if you're caught. Government is the only thing that can back money with something that isn't worth anything, except when the government says it is. So if you back the reserve currency with private sector hard assets, which the commercial banking and the central bank are set up to do, then, and do it in a way that provides liquidity for future capital formation, then the problem solves itself. You don't have to worry about trying to figure out how much money the economy needs, because the economy itself decides how much money it needs. And it does it on a sound basis. Now, this brings us into Kelso's definition of money. Why do we want to get rid of the experts telling us how much money we need and setting the value of it? Well, because as Kelso pointed out, and this is, we'll summarize, money is a way of measuring value and of carrying out economic transactions. It is not itself a commodity. Money as money has no value. Money that represents actual assets has value because it represents and measures those assets. And there is a defined legal claim linking that money creation to those assets. It's not just because the government has the right to tax people and they're backing the money with that right to tax people. No, there is a defined connection between the asset and the money itself. Now, so what is the purpose of a monetary system? At the most basic level, facilitate economic transactions. Why do you even need a monetary system if two people don't have to measure the value of what they're exchanging, or they don't have to store the value, or they're not exchanging anything? If you're not exchanging anything, you don't need a monetary system. Well, since human beings are by nature political animals, and an economy runs on people exchanging productions, I mean, what money does is allow me to exchange what I produce for what you produce. And that is the purpose of a monetary system. It isn't to control people, which is the way it's being used in a lot of economies today. It's not to allow the rich to become richer, which is also what it's doing. The sole purpose of a monetary system, when you get down to the most basic thing, is it's how we exchange productions among ourselves. This allows every producer to be a consumer and every consumer to be a producer. Now, what are the main features of the EDA monetary reforms? Well, shift from a government debt asset, excuse me, shift from government debt-backed reserve currency to a private sector asset-backed reserve currency. Because as I said, the private sector money that is denominated in the reserve currency is already asset-backed. We need to have the reserve currency itself asset-backed. And the other one is that you only create money in response to actual value. You don't try to create value by issuing money. You issue money only in response to actual value, either existing value or the present value of future value. And as I said, the EDA tax reforms, well, primarily what you do is, first of all, reform the tax system so that it does what a tax system is supposed to do, which is raise revenue for the government so it can meet its legitimate expenses. The tax system is not supposed to be used for social engineering. It's not supposed to be used to provide money for capital, formation. The sole purpose of a tax system is to raise money to run government. And you could probably get rid of just about the entire tax code, the millions of pages of it, simply by carrying through that one tax reform. The other is the one provision we need in corporate tax law is to make dividends tax deductible at the corporate level, and possibly even raise the corporate income tax, and make dividends received by shareholders treated as ordinary income, unless they are used to purchase capital assets under the Economic Democracy Act, in which case the tax on those dividends is deferred until the capital that is purchased is sold. That's everything else is window dressing or technicalities that we don't need to get into. And as I said, the purpose of a tax system, raise revenue for government. If it's doing anything else, you're messing around with something that you really shouldn't be messing around with. And the main features of the EDA tax reforms is make dividends tax deductible at the corporate level and treated as ordinary income at the individual recipient level, unless it's treated as a tax deferral to purchase capital assets. Now, the EDA inheritance and gift tax reforms. This is the easiest one. Don't tax the estate, tax the recipient. That way, the entire estate can be spread out among all the people who should be getting it, rather than keeping it all together to keep the existing power structure in place. Now, the key principles, what it does is you shift the inheritance and gift taxes from the large, as I said, from the estate and the wealthy owner to the recipients. And if a lot of the people who are receiving it have their, say, $1 million tax deferral, they can receive $1 million and not even pay taxes on it if they put it immediately into capital assets. Whereas if you give it all to the same person, well, you're going to get one heck of a tax bill, because all of it is taxed rather than the way it is now, where the estate is taxed and the recipient gets it tax-free. And what this does is you actually eliminate inheritance and gift taxes, and the rich have an incentive to spread out their estates rather than keep it all bundled up. Now, what will the Economic Democracy Act deliver to every citizen? Well, it will enable every single person to acquire on favorable terms that doesn't decrease their consumption income, a capital ownership stake that will allow them what Kelso called a level of capital sufficiency that will enable them to be able to have income that does not rely on labor income or charity or welfare or government redistribution, but on their own ownership of capital. So that by making it possible for every single person to become a capital owner on favorable terms, and of course, getting on this new technology, it will not only finance the new technology, it will make everybody who benefits from that new technology an owner of the new technology. And this will provide, as I said, every single citizen from birth to death with, now, one of the things that Daniel Webster pointed out back in 1820 during the congressional debates on the amending the Constitution to allow non-owners to vote, was he said, power naturally and necessarily follows property. Aristotle knew this. George Mason knew this. The people who wrote the Bible knew this. If you are an owner, you are a free person. If you are not an owner, you are a de facto slave. I mean, Aristotle said, as I pointed out earlier, if you are a nominally free person, but you don't own anything, you are actually a masterless slave because you are at everybody else's behest. And a slave is someone who is totally at the behest of another. And if you don't own property, you are at the behest of somebody who does own property. And it also provides a moral basis for uniting every single citizen. You may be of different races, you may be of different religions, you may be of different all kinds of things. But if you're a capital owner, you are meeting on equal footing with every single other capital owner. So that the message that you should take away today, if you take nothing else, is that if you don't own, you are owned. So own or be owned. I think that, yeah, there's the last slide.